The Age of Enlightenment is hard to define. If you had 10 historians in a room, they'd probably have 10 different ways to explain it. Some of them would say there's not one Enlightenment, but many. And at least one would say there's no such thing at all. So we're just doing our best here, as always. Why are we talking about the Enlightenment if it's so murky? Because one way or another, the ways that many people explain the world began to change in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. In a wide variety of places and among people who were both elite and non-elite, there emerged a greater sense that the natural world could be understood through reason and experiment, and that maybe the political and social world could be analyzed in those ways as well. Maybe human beings could even use reason to change things for the better. That sounds appealing and familiar, right? Enlightenment thinking led some people to question authority, resist traditional hierarchies, argue for an end to religious intolerance, and use science in order to improve people's lives. At the same time, the Enlightenment emphasized classification and tended to propose universal truths that were not universal, but instead posited European ways of thinking and living as the standard. This helped produce further racist hierarchies and justifications for imperialism. So it's important to use our reason to fully analyze the Age of Reason, another name for this period. So Enlightenment thinkers promoted liberty and justice, and that shaped the present. And Enlightenment thinkers promoted unjust categories and justified human bondage, and that also shaped the present. Some familiar faces, such as Thomas Jefferson, turn up in just about every dimension, inspirational and tragic, of the Enlightenment ideas we've discussed. And some really important new liberties so far only really applied to land-owning white men. But I'm getting ahead of myself. British colonies were a mix of cultures. Ideas and customs from the old world took on new forms in their new circumstances, bringing with them new questions and new choices. And you know what happens when people make choices? History is made. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, U.S. History to 1865. One of the values most heavily associated with the Enlightenment is scientific advancement. And what better way to explore this than with one of the most famous scientific discoveries of all time? Everyone knows the story of British scientist Sir Isaac Newton discovering gravity. The story goes that Newton was sitting under an apple tree when he saw an apple fall, causing him to identify a force that pulls objects towards the Earth. Most historians agree that this story is embellished at best, but it does help illustrate how the Enlightenment encouraged a shift to rational thought. People had been noticing fruit falling off trees since before we were people, but Newton started asking questions about the hows and the whys. And then he started to expand his explanations to the moon and the sun without any need for vengeful fruit-dropping fairies. As the name would imply, the Age of Reason sought logical explanations that could be universally applied regardless of culture. The English were not the only Europeans to begin seeing the world in a new way. After King Philip V assumed the Spanish throne, a series of political policy changes called the Bourbon Reforms was set in motion. The Bourbon Reforms were promoted in Spain throughout the 18th century by Philip V and his successors, who had a bunch of goals in mind. They hoped to regain control of transatlantic trade and rebuild royal wealth, in part by making Spanish America a more stable source of revenue for the crown. Later reforms also aimed to deplete the influential power of the church, a huge shift in ideology for the extremely Catholic country of Spain. In the British colonies, some guy named Thomas Jefferson was exploring the ideals of the Enlightenment through writing. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson detailed Virginia's flora and fauna, geography, and politics. He also described the appalling effects of slavery on enslavers and the enslaved, making it clear he believed it to be both inhumane and illogical. However, he also offered pseudoscientific and racist depictions of what he considered the differences between Africans and Europeans. And despite correctly assessing the cruelties of slavery, he himself enslaved hundreds of Africans. Jefferson is even believed to have fathered several children with Sally Hemings, one of the enslaved women on his plantation. Though he continued to promote enlightened ideas and concepts in his writing, Jefferson didn't exactly practice what he preached. Speaking of preaching, it's important to note that the Enlightenment wasn't an anti-religious movement. Rather, it encouraged people to combine their faith with reason. Now known as the Jefferson Bible, Thomas Jefferson wrote a book pulling the moral lessons from the New Testament while also excluding all miracles and mentions of the supernatural. Though the text was never published, Jefferson demonstrated the contemporary ideals of applying logic to faith, rather than the other way around. In Eastern Europe, some Jewish scholars encouraged their communities to assign value to secular learning as well as to their faith. But the 18th century also saw a movement known as the Great Awakening. Gone were the days of puritanical levels of devotion, and churches were seeing emptier pews each Sunday. Desperate to bring back their congregations, Protestant churches throughout the English colonies tried to become more expressive and charismatic. And it worked. Local communities began seeing bigger crowds turn up to these new, expressive, emotional church services. Many found themselves newly dedicated to religion, and the movement had a lasting impact on church services in many Christian denominations. Even while new ideas spread throughout Europe and the New World, many of the colonies were still pretty English. During the early years of the Enlightenment, colonists did their best to mimic the trends from back across the pond. They built houses in the same style, toasted the king, and tried to dress in the latest fashions. But try as they might to keep the comforts of home, the colonies were still very different from England. Indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans had their own music, religious traditions, and food, all of which influenced the new cultural practices developing in the colonies. It's critical to note that even while colonists touted Enlightenment ideals such as liberty and tolerance, they continued to rely on the work of enslaved people who contributed various forms of cultural knowledge in addition to physical labor. To this day, traditions all over the United States have their roots in the cultural practices of indigenous and enslaved African peoples. And as if this episode didn't have enough irony, the state of Georgia was originally dedicated to the ideals of the Enlightenment. When James Oglethorpe founded the colony in 1732, Georgia did not allow slavery, although the consensus is that this was for economic and political reasons and not moral reasons. And of course, this didn't last, and slavery was later legalized in 1751. Georgia was also home to the Trustee Garden, a community garden dedicated to botany and agriculture. Established in 1734, the Trustee Garden sat on a 10-acre plot and ran as a kind of agricultural research station/nursery, where they'd learn what plants would grow well in Georgia, as well as providing farmers with plants so that they could grow them themselves. While some colonists were content to remain loyal subjects of the King of England, the Enlightenment led to a lot of colonists who were unhappy with the, shall we say, political atmosphere. Buoyed by the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and social progress, people began to resent the royal governors of large colonies. Localized assemblies and committees became a more popular form of governing the communities, and the colonists began to oppose the monarchy by resisting the authority of their governors. Could we be explaining the developing resistance to colonial rule in a different way? Like by emphasizing anger over taxation, or resentment of wealthy colonial landowners, or veterans of the French and Indian War ticked off at the British officers they'd served under? Absolutely we could. Like we said, historical thinking requires making choices. In this episode, we're focusing on ideas. If you're questioning whether ideas were as important as we're suggesting, well, Enlightenment thinkers would be proud. The desire to govern the colonies themselves led many of the colonists to adopt Republicanism, a set of ideas that encouraged citizens to defend their liberty through active political participation. The Enlightenment saw the colonies become increasingly profitable, as well as develop new cultural movements and social practices. But that profitability was largely due to increased labor from enslaved Africans, and many of these new social practices excluded women. Kind of a one step forward, two steps back situation. Political, social, economic, and religious reforms made during this time set the stage for the rise of a new nation. But the very ideals that led colonists to rebel against the British Empire were often contradicted. We are a nation founded on protest. But engagement with protest remains just as influenced by privilege and power dynamics as ever. For now, suffice to say that the defense of liberty has been a big deal here for a long time. As to what liberty actually means and who gets to experience it, we'll get to that next time. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865. Which is part of the Study Hall project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU at the links in the description. See you next time.